Okay, so this is our presentation on environmental injustice against Indigenous groups in Georgia by me, Natasha, and Jillian. So let's talk about the background a little bit. According to the Department of Geology and Geography at Lenham College in New York City, environmental injustice can be defined as the disproportionate exposure of communities of color and the poor to pollution and its associated effects on health and environment, as well as the unequal environmental protection and environmental quality provided through laws, regulations, governmental programs, enforcement, and policies. American Indians and Alaskan Natives, along with other minorities, have faced generations of environmental injustice in not only Georgia, but throughout the United States. For example, the Pine Ridge Indiana Reserve, located in South Dakota and home to over 25,000 Oglala Lakota people, is constantly poverty-stricken, with an astonishing 49% of residents living below the federal poverty level, in comparison to Georgia's 13.3%. The infant mortality rate and the cancer mortality rate are also higher than that of the overall population. While many of these health risks have also been attributed to poverty levels in recent years, organizations like Women of All Red Nations, or WARN, have sought to prove that many of these health problems are from years' worth of uranium contamination and toxic chemical exposure. The Pine Ridge Reservation is in the southeast portion of the Black Hills, which was the site of an extensive uranium mine and mill for 30 years between 1940 and 1970. Studies have even traced alpha radiation in groundwater and surface water sources throughout the Pine Ridge town. This is, of course, not the only example of environmental injustice in America. In fact, that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. This example of the Pine Ridge Indian Reserve really helps to emphasize the extent of the environmental injustice against Indigenous groups and how worldly the problem really is. Other examples that pertain to Georgia alone include coastal tribes like the Gual, Yamasee, and the Timucua. All three tribes were killed off or sold into slavery via the Spanish Empire. There were also tribes in the North Georgia area, like the Cherokee tribe, who were infamously sent to their death on the Trail of Tears. In inland Georgia, tribes like the Creek or Muskogee tribes were forced off their land in the early 1802 by early American settlers. And the picture to the right there is actually native tribe art from the Timucua tribe along coastal Georgia.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the problem that we focused on. And when you look into a lot of the issues faced by Indigenous peoples in the U.S., it tends to stem from the fact that their land was stolen. So, like we mentioned with the tribes in Georgia, Muskogee, coastal tribes like the Timucuan, their land was taken away, and that was largely due to the fact that the U.S. government did not allow collective land ownership, which was the most traditional form of living on land together in Indigenous tribes. And if we look at the Cherokee as a more specific example, some of the legal cases that quote unquote legally took away their rights and their land would be Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which determined Native American tribes to merely be domestic dependent nations. So this completely ignored their sovereignty or the fact that they were here before the colonizers. And here you can see on the side a political cartoon from the time about the Cherokee Nation just being ripped apart and exploited by the colonizers the same way they did to the environment. And like Abby mentioned, the Trail of Tears, that's something we tend to learn about in school, but that's just barely scratches the surface of the injustices that happened even just in Georgia. And we tend to learn about the social impacts somewhat of removing Indigenous people from, of course, it's their ancestral home. That's where they've lived for generations. So that has a huge social impact on culture, the physical, mental health of the people, but it also has ecological impacts because the indigenous people have lived off their land for generations and they understand it well. And that's a type of knowledge that is can't be gained overnight. So it's very valuable, and that they had to live sustainably in order to survive for all those generations. And that is something that is also lost, or was lost and is still lost when the indigenous people were, their land was stolen. And for example, if you look at things that have replaced where they used to live on the coast, we have a lot of tourism and we have a lot of urbanization, and that has not really been done in a sustainable way. And that's something that Georgia's having to deal with now, and especially as those problems are being exacerbated by climate change. And then on the whole, all of these problems are exacerbated by the lack of education surrounding this issue, which is something that you'll notice as a common thread in our presentation. And then in relation to this problem, we analyzed who are the stakeholders involved in those missing. And as you might imagine, the stakeholders missing are the indigenous peoples that are actually affected by all of this. So when they were removed from their lands, their voices were not considered. And the court orders that happened that affected them also did not consider their voices. For example, after the Muskogee and Cherokee they were displaced and forced to go to Oklahoma, then their lands there were forced to be allotted because, like I mentioned, collective land ownership wasn't allowed. And if the U.S. court, was biased against the Native Americans, determined a Native American person to be what they thought was legally incompetent or not mentally stable enough, they would use that as an excuse to assign them a legal guardian who was then often able to take advantage of the lands they were assigned. And when oil was discovered on these lands, that became a huge issue with all the fraud that happened. And the history about what happened to these peoples, especially in Georgia, where all we really have left at this point is the history. It also excludes indigenous perspectives, which we'll get a bit more into later. And then even the discussions of solutions for what should happen to reconcile the past injustices that Native Americans have suffered, sometimes they don't include the indigenous people, which should obviously be at the forefront of being able to decide just compensation, because some people are advocating for reparations, but while monetary compensation might be more feasible, it's not really an adequate form of compensation for what happened. It wasn't money wasn't and still isn't the issue. It's that their self-determination and sovereignty was taken away. So that's what one of the papers we read talked about, and this author has worked with the Chiricahua Apache Nation, and so that is an example of how people can work together, indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples, to determine what's the best solution for what should happen going forward.
So some past and current efforts to find some solutions kind of revolve, one, around how Native Americans haven't been given a proper say in discussing their environmental issues. However, we are now finally being able to see better representation of Native Americans, especially now that the Biden administration has put Deb Haaland in charge of the Department of the Interior, making her the first Native American to run this department, which specifically aids in reservations and protected lands. In Georgia, on the other hand, a group of lawmakers have recently introduced Georgia House Bill 432, which requires a representative from each racial minority to be present when passing any legislation. This bill won't be up for vote until the 2023 session, And it's up to Georgia residents to continue to push for this, as it would allow for laws that would negatively impact people of color to not be passed. On the other hand, there's the question of how we should discuss Native Americans and their history. And some places have been created just to talk about this. So for instance, in the 1980s, the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve was made in Jacksonville, Florida. And it was made to help teach people about this tribe specifically and how they impacted Southeast Georgia and Northeast Florida. However, it wrongfully highlights environmental injustice as it is very close to dumping sites for the Jax Naval Base and does not properly explain what truly happened to the Timucuan. The preserve also features a plantation on the property where Timucuan and others were enslaved, and for some reason romanticizes this disturbing site by allowing weddings and more to occur here instead of the proper respect it deserves. There is also the Cumberland Island National Seashore, which in the 90s began to teach more about the Timucua who lived there. But after discussing with a former park ranger from Cumberland, it was also noted that what is being taught there is that the Timucua lived with settlers and were friendly enough to give up their land, instead of what truly happened, which was a mass genocide done by colonizers. So at the current moment, there are very few groups established down there trying to fix these issues and trying to give more of a voice, but this desperately needs to change and get more attention. Overall, things are currently happening that are beneficial, but a lot more needs to be done. And one thing in particular is that we need to highlight the books and websites made by these Indigenous groups that tell us their real story.
So some new solutions and future directions include, again, Georgia House Bill 432, which is on the 2023 session docket. This would be a huge step moving forward with raising the voices of Black, Indigenous, or people of color in Georgia. However, this is just one step forward, and it's up to Georgia residents to continue pushing for this bill so we can actually vote on it when the time comes, because quite a few members of the Georgia government do not seem to understand the bill's importance. Future direction should include broadening participation and encouraging learning. A way we could do this is by funding and raising the voices of many Native Americans who have dedicated their time to create websites and more that tell the real story of what happened to their people. There also needs to be more working groups made in the Southeast and along the coast that maintain contact with the remaining members of the tribes in order to boost their stories and traditions so it won't continue to be whitewashed. Other solutions include land restoration, reconciliation, and self-determination through law. Also, an advisory board of stakeholders, which include Indigenous, current residents on lands, and government officials. Reconciliation efforts must be negotiated and addressed by individual nations to proceed.
Here we have our references. So we hope you all enjoyed.